The room went dead silent, and not the polite, awkward kind of silence you get when a meeting goes sideways. This was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. It was the summer of 1991, and in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of Arista Records' New York offices, a senior vice president named Richard Harmon had just said out loud what several executives had been whispering for months. He leaned back in his chair, straightened his cufflinks, and looked directly at Clive Davis across the mahogany table. "Clive," he said, his voice measured and cold. "Whitney is finished. The voice is still there, sure, but the sound is over. R&B is dying and pop is changing. If we don't reinvent her as something harder, something edgier, we're going to be sitting here in 2 years wondering what happened to our investment." If you subscribe to this channel, you already know that Whitney Houston's story never went the way anyone planned. And what happened in the hours after Richard Harmon spoke those words is something most people have never heard. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. To understand why that moment in the conference room felt like a death sentence, you have to go back to where Whitney Houston started. Not the stadiums, not the Grammy stage, not the glossy magazine covers. You have to go back to Newark, New Jersey, to the New Hope Baptist Church, where a little girl with a voice that didn't seem possible stood next to her mother, Cissy Houston, and sang like she had been doing it since before she was born. Because in a way, she had. Whitney Houston grew up surrounded by gospel royalty. Her mother, Cissy, was a legend in her own right, a background vocalist who had sung with Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick. Her godmother was Aretha herself. Music wasn't a career path in that household. It was the air they breathed, the language they used to talk to God. And Whitney's voice, even as a child, was something that made grown adults stop mid-conversation and stare. There was no artifice to it, no technique layered over emptiness. When Whitney sang in that church, she meant every single syllable. Every note came from somewhere deep and real and unashamed. She wasn't performing. She was testifying. But by the time Clive Davis signed her to Arista in 1983, the music industry had its own ideas about what Whitney Houston should be. And those ideas had very little to do with Newark or gospel or testifying. The executives saw a breathtaking young woman with a crossover voice and dollar signs in their eyes. They dressed her in pearls. They softened her edges. They handed her pop songs crafted by committee and surrounded her with the smoothest, safest production money could buy. And it worked, commercially speaking. Her debut album in 1985 became one of the best-selling debut albums in history. She charted, she won, she smiled for the cameras in elegant gowns and said all the right things at all the right events. But somewhere in the machinery of her own success, the girl from New Hope Baptist Church was getting quieter and quieter. There were people around her who noticed. Her vocal coach at the time, a woman named Patricia Singletary, later recalled watching her prepare for a television performance in 1989 and feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the studio air conditioning. "She hit every note perfectly," Patricia said. "Technically, it was flawless. But it felt like watching someone do an impression of Whitney Houston, like the real one had stepped back behind glass and left a copy out front." The industry wanted a perfect pop princess, and Whitney had learned to be exactly that. The cost was something she carried alone. Which brings us back to that conference room in 1991. Richard Harmon wasn't wrong about the numbers. The music landscape was shifting. Grunge was exploding out of Seattle. Hip-hop was rewriting the rules of what popular music could sound like. New Jack Swing was pushing R&B into harder, more rhythmic territory. And there sat Whitney Houston, the reigning queen of a sound that some were already calling too polished, too pristine, too safe. "The audience wants authenticity now," Harmon continued, spreading a sheaf of sales projections across the table like evidence. "They want grit. They want edge. We need to rebuild her from the ground up. New producers, new sound, new image. She's 27 years old. There's still time to do this right." Clive Davis sat very still, the way he always did when he was thinking hard. He had built Arista around his ability to see what others missed. He had believed in her when she was still a teenager, singing backup for her mother. But the numbers were sitting right there on the mahogany table, and numbers have a way of making even believers hesitate. What none of the men in that room knew was that 48 hours earlier, Whitney had been in a recording session at Right Track Studios on West 48th Street, working on something she hadn't told any of them about. She had gone in quietly, without anyone whose job it was to keep things on brand. She had gone in with a pianist and a sound engineer she trusted, Marcus Webb, and she had asked them to pull up a Dolly Parton song, not a pop song, not a dance track, a country ballad from 1973 called I Will Always Love You, a song so simple and so honest that it barely seemed to belong in the same universe as the overproduced pop machinery that had defined Whitney's career for the better part of a decade. Marcus Webb remembered what happened when Whitney stood at the microphone that first time. She didn't do anything for about a minute, he said, just stood there with her eyes closed. Gerald played the opening notes and she just listened, and then she opened her mouth and I swear to God, the room changed. Not the sound, the actual room, the air in it. It was like something that had been locked up for a very long time just walked out. The version of I Will Always Love You that Whitney recorded in that session was not the version that would eventually appear on the Bodyguard soundtrack. That recording would come later, with a full orchestral arrangement built around it. But this first version, stripped down and raw and searingly honest, was the one that mattered most. Because this was the version where Whitney stopped performing and started telling the truth. She sang it 3 times that night. The first time, she was finding the song, learning its contours, respecting its simplicity. The second time, she started to inhabit it. And the third time, Marcus Webb said, he sat in the control room with tears running down his face and did not touch a single dial, because touching anything would have been an act of violence against what was happening on the other side of the glass. Whitney sang that song the third time with everything she had ever felt and everything she had ever swallowed to be palatable enough for the industry that owned her. She sang it with the girl from New Hope Baptist Church and the freedom of someone who has finally stopped caring whether the executives approve. Back in the conference room, Clive Davis had just said something that surprised everyone, including himself. He had told Richard Harmon to hold off. Give me 2 weeks, he said, without fully explaining why. Something in his gut, built over decades of listening to music for a living, told him to wait. He didn't know about the Right Track session yet, but Clive Davis had not built one of the most successful careers in the history of the recording industry by ignoring his gut. 2 weeks turned into 4. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, Whitney walked into Clive's office on the 32nd floor and sat down across from him without her publicist, without her manager, without the usual buffer of handlers that surrounded her. She put a cassette tape on his desk. Play it, she said. Clive Davis would later describe what happened when he pressed play as one of the 3 or 4 most significant moments of his professional life. The piano came in first, just those simple opening notes, and then Whitney's voice arrived and everything else stopped being relevant. I knew in the first 8 seconds, he said. I knew it was the thing that changed everything. He listened to the entire recording without speaking. When it was over, he pressed rewind and listened again. Whitney sat across from him and watched his face. She had walked into that office terrified. Not of Clive exactly, but of the answer. Because that recording was not the calculated commercial move. It was something far more dangerous. It was honest. And honest was the one thing the music industry had been quietly discouraging her from being for the better part of a decade. When Clive Davis finally looked up from the cassette player, his expression was not the careful neutrality of a man making a business calculation. It was something more unguarded than that. Where has this been? He asked her. It was not an accusation. It was a question that contained its own sorrow, because both of them understood the answer. It had been there the whole time, in the girl who sang at New Hope Baptist Church, in the woman who had learned to hide that girl behind gowns and pearls and perfectly constructed pop hooks. It had been there every single time she stood in front of a microphone and chose technical perfection over soul, because technical perfection was what the room expected, and soul was too unpredictable, too ungovernable, too much. Richard Harmon's memo about reinvention was quietly shelved. That conversation did not happen again. What happened instead was The Bodyguard, the most commercially successful soundtrack album in the history of recorded music, And Whitney Houston standing in front of the world, singing with everything she actually was, the world responding in a way that made every spreadsheet and every market research report look like a child's drawing. The recording of I Will Always Love You for the Bodyguard soundtrack took place over several sessions and grew into the towering, orchestrated, now legendary version that billions of people know. But the people who were in the room for those sessions talk about a particular moment that doesn't appear in any documentary or liner note. It happened during the final take of the song's iconic ending, the extended vocal run that builds and builds until it becomes something almost unbearable in its beauty. David Foster had the arrangement set, the orchestra was dialed in, everything was technically ready, and Whitney stood at the microphone and closed her eyes, and the girl from Newark showed up completely, without apology, without the glass between her and the world. She hit notes that the engineers hadn't accounted for in the mix. She held them longer than anyone expected. And when she finally let the last note go, there was a pause of several seconds before anyone in the control room remembered how to speak. Foster broke the silence first. "I don't know what just happened," he said, "but I know we're never doing it again." He meant it as a compliment, which is exactly how Whitney took it. She opened her eyes, looked through the glass at the faces staring back at her, and smiled. Not the composed, professional smile of the pop princess, the real one. The song was released in November 1992 and spent 14 consecutive weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It remains the best-selling physical single of all time. Richard Harmon left Arista in 1993. But here is the thing about that version of Whitney Houston, the honest one, the unguarded one, the one who walked into Clive Davis's office with a cassette tape and no safety net. She had always been there. The industry had not created her, and the industry could not destroy her. Every carefully constructed pop compromise, every decision to sand down the gospel edges to make the sound more palatable, all of it had simply been weight stacked on top of something that could not be buried. Because some voices are not really voices at all. They are more like facts. They exist independent of strategy and quarterly sales projections. They exist independent of what any executive in a 32nd floor conference room believes the market wants. Whitney Houston's voice was a fact, and on the night she stood in that studio and sang a Dolly Parton song 3 times until she broke herself open, the world got to hear it.